Palace of Mirrors, Season 1, Episode 7, The Derelict Ship. Darien crept through the darkness feeling like an intruder. The flashlight he had found in a supply closet touched moments intimate and long forgotten. He passed rooms, still and silent, that waited for people to return. Darien couldn't end the wait. He couldn't sit in chairs bereft of purpose in the shadows. He couldn't play with toys scattered in the dust across the floor. He couldn't turn on screens sitting black on the walls. Darien could not clear away the cobwebs and sweep the debris from the floors. All he could do was bear witness to what had once been. He wondered, had people abandoned the city all at once, or had they left little by little? One day, had there been a single person standing in a single room, calling into the shadows, searching, alone? Had that one person given in with a great sigh that silence swallowed? The sword led him through a chamber where the glass ceiling had long since broken. Wind sang along the opening above, and water dripped from the frames that once held the windows. The fragments had broken down to a crystal sand that crunched under his boots. The sword led him past hulking ships that had been stripped down to bones. The sword led him up a spiraling staircase to a balcony that looked down on a factory floor. Unfinished shapes lay on rotted conveyor belts. It led Darien to a long hall, bare and dark, with doors leading to rooms that would never be opened again. The end of the passage opened into a cavernous space. Skylights, unbroken still, let natural light spill down into a space that had been built when people still dreamed of big things. Darien held his breath as he stepped into the room. He felt so small, like a child looking up at his father. The room lay empty, and that seemed wrong deep in Darien's bones. This place had not been built for emptiness. Silence lay heavy on the place, and that seemed wrong as well. This room had not been built for silence. It hardly seems the same place at all. The room swallowed the sword's voice. How long had it been since anyone had spoken there? How desperate must this room be for a voice, any voice at all? Or did it rest peacefully? Did it fear the return of voices with all their peaks and valleys? At any hour of the day or night, it was filled with starships and people and light. Darien nodded, but couldn't speak in the black empty space. He felt it close around him on every side. Walking in that darkness was like walking through a world without time. Had he been traveling for hours, or had it been only instants? The skylights overhead could only brush up against the darkness. All at once Darien found himself before a great arched set of double doors that stretched an impossible distance above. The doors were open a crack, but that opening was more than wide enough for Darien to stroll through. Wind swept away the breath Darien had been holding as he stepped outside. Golden embossed vines twined along the frames of the doors. Stars and planets had been set into them. They glittered gold and silver even in the dull daylight. Towering pillars of cracked metal and glass framed a landing pad, which was set between the buildings like a courtyard. Many doors like the one Darien had just exited faced the tarmac on every side. Ships came from all over the Empire to this small moon, Knight spoke quietly. It lay between the heart and the outer worlds. Darien walked to the center of the landing pad. Grass, blue and green, had crept along fine cracks in the pavement. Trees, the twisted ones native to Six, had pushed up through the man-made stone. Darien stopped beside one of the larger trees and leaned against the trunk. The warmth of the bark, the sweet scent of sap, and the wind rustling the leaves, these things comforted Darien. He had spent so many summer days cradled in the branches of a tree. So, Sword, where do we go from here? You call me Sword as though I were just some common captain's blade. Darien glanced down at the hilt hanging awkwardly at his side from a scabbard he had found in the room where he had found the weapon. You say that as though I know you aren't just some common captain's blade. Knight laughed. Do you think every sword talked in the days of the Empire? Darien shrugged. Till today, I didn't think any of them did. You may call me Knight. Yes, that should do for now. Darien stared at the hilt a moment longer. He knew less than nothing about it. What secrets did it have that made it want to keep its name hidden? How had it come to be in that room? Why had it been spying on Mariala's family? Okay, Knight then. Where do we go from here? The soldiers who took Mariala wore a variant on the uniform for the Anchor Militia. Given this fact, I believe they've taken her there. Anchor? One of the 4 major cities on the moon. We stand in the ruins of Starfall, the port city. Anchor was the imperial seat and the largest of the 4. If my records are correct, it is the only city still occupied. Anchor? I've never heard it called anything other than the city. My apologies. I've been buried for a very long time, and I've been active for even longer. I sometimes forget when I am. His voice dropped. I sometimes forget that so very much has changed. Darien looked out into the city with all its shadows. He tightened his grip on the tree and looked down at Knight. The sword looked bright, even under the daylit clouds. So, we're going to the city? Knight didn't answer for a moment. Yes, but I don't believe we can make the trip fast enough. Even with the horses from the barn, we might lose a month on the road. I have reason to believe that Mariala will be taken off-world. Darien shook his head. Off? Off-world? Why would anyone do that? We can talk about that later, but for now, we must make haste. Darien felt a surge of frustration. Later? Don't you think I need to know now? And what difference does it make anyway? There's no faster way to get there. My old master, he used to say, when you have no hope left, you must take hopeless actions. There's a storehouse several days from here. Many years ago, I discovered it while hacking into what remains of the city's network. It's one of the few remaining places with working surveillance. Hacking into the... I don't even know what you're talking about. The meaning of those words is immaterial. All you need to understand is that about 5 years ago, a band of pirates began to use it as a supply depot. Darien's mouth went dry, and he felt dizzy. If he hadn't had a tree to hold on to, he thought he would have fallen over. He thought of Tom standing in the rain, his arms outstretched to the sky. He thought of Tom, blood smeared across his face, sitting in the kitchen. The man with the eye of a demon. The woman with 2 swords. She laughed when Billy tried to save his sister. She laughed and cut his legs out from under him, and then that thing. He drove his sword right through my little boy. Pirates? What about them? Why are you telling me this? They have a ship. Knight's voice quivered like the drawn string of a bow. Not a broken husk like those in the ruins we just passed through. A ship. With it, we could be at the city in minutes. Darien drew the sword and held it, shaking, up to his face. We don't have it, though. You just told me pirates have it. It might as well be on Leviathan for all the good it does us. We can lay an ambush. I've watched them for years now. I know their patterns. We can take their ship. Darien shook his head. You're mad! Knight paused for a powerful gust of wind. Yes, I may be mad. I have often wondered. All these many, many years I have wondered. If the sword had lungs, it could have sighed. If it had eyes, they might have turned down, tears caught in the lashes. If it had arms, they might have been crossed tight, the fists clenched. It had none of these things. It had only steel and leather, cold and lifeless. If I'm mad or not makes no difference. We must do this thing. It is as simple as that. Once upon a time, ships landed where Darien now stood. Once upon a time, the buildings around him would have stood tall and gleaming, a testament to all that had come before and all that would come after. Once upon a time, the sun shone down through the not-so-thick clouds, and stars climbed an inky black sky at night. In those days, this had been a place for noise and motion and life. Now, it was a quiet place. It was a place where only the rustle of the trees' leaves whispered, and its roots cracked against the pavement, so small a sound Darien could not even hear it. Still, it sounded there, beneath his feet. He looked to the sword. You promise this is the way, the only way. Darien, there is always more than one way. There are millions upon millions. Variations so small you would not realize they were there at all, and yet they would matter in the end. Of all the possibilities I have calculated, this is the most likely to succeed. But I can't foresee every possibility. The universe is infinite, and I am not. Only the Palace of Mirrors can see it all, but it keeps its secrets. Darien looked up at the branches of the tree, splitting and splitting and splitting in a never-ending fractal. He felt like an ant, trying to find its way on the branches to some destination far at the top, hidden by the canopy of leaves. Very well. Lead the way, knight. He followed the sword's voice across the tarmac, away from the whispering tree. 2 towers of broken glass rose on either side of the road leading out of the city. The skeleton of a bridge arched between them in the sky. Wind-blown dunes of dirt covered the road, except where the buildings stood and blocked the ever-blowing wind. There, in the shadow of that bridge, the ancient road emerged. No cracks wrote its surface. The edges had not worn with time. The builders of this road had lain it to last. They had not even considered the possibility that there might come a time when it would not be. Darien stepped from the loose soil onto this timeless road. It devoured his step, so that not a sound emerged. He took another step, and another, into the shadow of the bridge above. The shadow chilled his skin, that familiar chill of winter. It was the chill of a dark, still night. The chill of a morning when the fire had died to embers in the stove. It was the chill of Kathy's empty bed. Has it always been this cold? Darien asked the question, not expecting an answer. This has ever been a cold world, but not always this cold. Knight's voice seemed small between the 2 buildings. I believe the weather control satellites have failed. Satellites? Darien glanced down at the glowing red eyes of the bird on the sword's hilt. That word isn't familiar to me. No, it wouldn't be. The sword paused. You know about gravity, at least. Darien rolled his eyes. I'm a farmer, not a fool. Yes, well, things that once even a fool would have known are now long forgotten. Darien frowned, but Knight continued. If an object falls at just the right trajectory, it can become trapped, ever falling and never landing. It enters orbit and becomes a satellite. Orbit. I've heard that word. My Aunt Kathy used it in her stories. I never really understood what it meant. Your world is a satellite. It orbits a gas giant planet. And that gas giant itself orbits a star. Even that star is tugged and pulled by the stars around it. In a sense, there is nothing in space that is not falling. They passed the shadow and stood on the edge between the uncovered road and the wind-swept soil. They stood on the edge of the ruins and the empty rolling hills. Crumpled buildings cluttered the landscape, like the skeletons of ancient creatures that had come there to die. Mountains, like the razor teeth of an enormous monster, made up the farthest horizon. Night? Yes, Darien. Do you remember the forgotten things? Darien looked from those mountains to the sword, Or are they truly forgotten? I remember much that has been forgotten, the sword replied. But there is much and more that is lost to even me. Come, we have many miles to cross. Darien followed the buried road from the city. Hundreds of miles separated him from Mariala, miles filled with hills and forests and ravines deeper than winter itself. Miles filled with Ragnar cats, hungry and with teeth sharper than the mountains. Miles filled with buried roads and forgotten knowledge. Darien made camp in the middle of the abandoned road. He'd seen many ruined buildings that had been alone for so long they had become a part of the landscape. Unlike the ruined city, these ruined shapes no longer even looked like human habitation. Vines, thick and thorned, covered the structures so that they looked more like strange plants than buildings. Once, Darien caught sight of the knife-blade eyes of a Ragnar cat peering out from a shadowed doorway. A pack of rodents rooted in a field that had gone feral. Trees grew up through the roofs and windows as naturally as they did from a boulder crevasse. The one thing Darien never saw on that journey was another person. He watched for signs of more recent habitation, but never saw so much as an acre of cultivated land. He never saw a barn sagging, but straight enough to stand. He never saw the ruts of wagon wheels. He never saw smoke rising up into the sky, or windmill blades turning in the breeze. So rather than look for a campsite, he laid out his few belongings on the road. His wild charge into the snowstorm and subsequent journey through the ruins had left him no time to gather supplies. He had no bag or tent, no food or water. He had only the strange clothing he had scavenged from the medical room where the robot had operated on him. He had managed to find a blanket as well, but it smelled strongly of mildew. So instead of wrapping it around himself, Darien leaned close to the small fire he managed to coax to life with the ease of someone born on a winter world. Instead of eating, he stared into the deepening night. He thought of Mariala's parents lying on the floor in the dark. He thought of how there would be no one to keep the shadows at bay, or lay their bodies out for burial, and no one to put mirrors in all the windows and on the front door to usher their spirits to the Palace of Mirrors. Even Darien's father had not denied these traditions when Kathy died. We should have buried them. Darien's voice broke. I just left them there to rot. Night remained silent. Darien turned the blade over and over in his hands, not really thinking what he did. When he stopped, the eyes of the sword stared up at him. They looked painfully bright against the night. When the sword spoke, those eyes grew dim as embers fading in a fire. You're right, Night laughed, broken glass on a stormy day. I watched Delani grow up. She used to be so small a child. When the fall winds began, I worried she would blow away, though I knew that the laws of physics made such a thing impossible. Still, some things go deeper than math. I always wanted to hold her down, but of course I could not. I wanted to keep her safe, but I could do nothing but watch and trust to the numbers that make me what I am. I'm sorry, Darien spoke softly. I never said that to you. I'm sorry for your loss. He squeezed his eyes shut. It doesn't seem enough, but it's all I have, and it's not enough by half. It's more sympathy than I deserve. Darien's eyes shot open and he stared at the sword. Why would you say that? You told me yourself you loved them. So what if I did? The sword's voice cut sharper than the blade. My love didn't help them. Trust me, they might have been better off without me. My love is a cursed thing. If you had any idea at all what I've done, what I've failed to do, if you did, you'd understand I deserve my pain. I don't deserve your condolences. A bird sounded in the darkness. Its voice warbled, an uneasy song to usher the night. It was a song of quiet, broken dreams, but Darien heard something else in that mournful call. He heard a song for a small campfire huddling against the night. Almost, just almost, it seemed a song for stars. Darien looked to the sky, but no, of course there were no stars to see. Pale frost, thin and fragile, cast a shadow over the world. It lay under a slate sky that seemed to be waiting for a wind strong enough to throw it aside. It was a silent morning. Even the birds wouldn't sing under that sky. Darien groaned and woke, the scent of mildew strong on the cold air. He didn't remember falling asleep. He just remembered the fire growing smaller and smaller, till it had been nothing more than a faint glow hiding in the deepest shadowed heart. He rose haltingly and let the blanket fall away. He rubbed the scar on his arm, not because it hurt, but because it seemed like it should hurt. Feeling the knot in his tissue, he heard the guns roaring. For a moment he stood in the room again, as though he had never left, as though everything that followed had only been some wild flight of fancy brought on by adrenaline and fear. His other hand twitched out and grabbed Knight. He spun with a deep breath to face the gunman, but already the moment had receded, and only the desolate road remained to face him. The sword's hilt felt warm, but the blade felt colder than that thin frost that had already begun to melt away. "You're so cold. You must have been made for winter." Knight laughed. "I was made for something much worse than the cold of your winter winds." Darien waited for the sword to say more, but it grew silent, while Darien set about building the fire back up from the night's embers. It crept out of the stacked logs like shadows creeping out in the evening. He rubbed his hands over the flames. As usual, the cold didn't truly bother him, but Darien knew it could kill him all the same if he didn't keep it at bay. Once he had warmed up, he stood and gave Knight a swing. The sword cut the air silently. It flew so smoothly that Darien couldn't resist swinging again. His arms swung without finesse, but the sword moved with grace all the same. It flew as though the act was breathing. "Thank you." The sword's voice broke with an emotion Darien couldn't place. "What for?" "I'd nearly forgotten what I am. I'd nearly forgotten the sky." Darien froze and lifted the hilt to his face so he could look the sword in the eye. "And what exactly are you?" "I think we've covered the topic." Darien rolled his eyes, trying not to get caught up on the fact that an electronic mind could be capable of such humor. "Yes, your sword, but why? Why a sword?" Knight did not reply. Color, just the barest edge of orange, lit the clouds. Wind swept in, and the clouds began to flow across the sky. Two birds sang together in a single scraggly tree growing at an angle out from under a boulder off the road. "It is not important what I am, who I am." "You'll have to tell me eventually." "The time may come, but it is not this morning, this sky, this place." "Still, it will come," Darien insisted. "No one can stop time." Darien stepped off the road and put a hand on the boulder. The stone felt as if it were made of ice, but it was just rock that had long ago given all its warmth to winter. Thick moss, heavy as a shadow, covered one side of the boulder. In the pale light, it looked like fur on a living thing. The tree growing out from under the rock had a snarl of exposed roots, some of which had climbed into cracks in the stone and tied it down to the ground. Timeless and cold and gray, the tree almost seemed more stone than the boulder itself. Darien wondered what he was doing, going after Mariala. It felt right, as though he were a hero in one of Kathy's stories. But could he really believe that he fit the role? He was just a boy with no food, no shelter, no help save the sword at his side. But when he imagined turning around, going back home, he found that he couldn't picture what would happen. If he did that, he would have to abandon utterly the conception of himself he had held since he understood the name his mother had given him. Darien knew hunger like an old friend. How many years had it followed him to sleep? How many years had he watched his father starve so that his family could go just another few days without empty stomachs? What kind of man might his father have been if he had never known that pain, never made that sacrifice? Would he have been able to dream? So standing beside his fire, Darien thought of hunger only as a practical necessity. He scanned the barren landscape. The trees didn't promise sustenance. Blue grass grew in clumps, but it would only give him cramps and leave him writhing in pain. The fire-red leaves of a carob plant, on the other hand, promised he wouldn't go hungry. The leaves themselves would burn his mouth and addle his mind, but the bone-white root buried in the stony soil could be eaten. The earth felt cold as snow against Darien's fingers and caked beneath his nails, but he didn't stop digging until he held the plant in his hands. He tore off the leaves and let them scatter on the wind. They tossed and turned and settled, restless as spilled blood. He placed a large flat rock carefully into the coals, rested the root on the stone, and waited. Every few minutes he turned it until steam began to whistle out a crack in the surface of the plant. If he'd had his knife, he would have cut it into smaller pieces, but he only had night. He considered using it, but a single look at the blade shimmering like silk decided him against it. The sword had not been crafted to cut food. But then, it didn't look as though it had been crafted to kill either. It looked beautiful. The metal crisp and clean as fresh water from a spring. The blade didn't look at all like the blood beneath Keith and Alani. It looked timeless as stone and innocent as freshly fallen snow. Darien felt the slice on his finger where he had touched the edge, and knew the sword had in fact been crafted to cut and to kill. It had killed, at some point in the past, Darien felt sure. The root scalded the top of his mouth and tasted of dust and snow. Boiled for days, it would grow soft, almost delicate, with a slightly sweet flavor. Darien didn't have days, so he chewed the fibrous plant slowly, working it until he could finally gag it down in a painful swallow. He left the fire still burning. His father would have boxed his ears, but his father was 100 miles away, and there were no forests here to set ablaze. Looking at the lone tree, Darien knew it would never catch fire. The whole world could burn to ashes, and that tree would survive, cold and still as stone. He and Knight walked in silence for hours until, about midday, Darien noticed a dark shape on the road ahead. Its curves and sharp points looked alien beside the bare dirt and the shadows of hunched trees. Chunks of jagged metal rose out of the earth around the road like monuments. A shiver welled up Darien's chest as he went past. He staggered to a stop as the shadow came into view. A cracked and crumpled starship lay beached on the road ahead. Most of the hull had been torn apart for scrap, but the great curving skeleton of the ship remained intact. It shimmered like the sword at Darien's side. Darien rested a shaking hand on one of the silver beams. He couldn't believe he stood here, touching something that had flown between the stars. Should he walk around the broken ship? Darien thought of Kathy and laughed. She would never have forgiven him for turning away. He stepped between the beams, feeling like a grave robber, but also with a thrill that brought him back to those long-ago days when he believed Kathy's every word. He imagined himself walking down a hall, the roof now just open sky. He heard a hum in the metal girders, and for an impossible moment believed it must be the engine of the ship. When he looked out, for that one moment, he expected to see stars. A blue metallic floor stretched like a tongue from a dark opening into a chunk of ship that had not been turned to scrap. Darien felt a sudden distrust at that dark mouth. Why had this one lone section been left untouched? Still, having come this far, he wasn't about to turn away now. He stepped inside, his breath rushing in and out of his chest. He no longer heard his feet on the metal floor over the thunder of his pulse. The hall ended at a door. Embossed dragons twined along the frame, emerald eyes glimmering in the scant light. It reminded him of the mirror he had given Tom, but no glass waited in the center, only a gray metal door adorned with a single airlock-style wheel. What? Darien ran his fingers over the dragons, but drew his hand back with a start. He had felt the metal humming, as though suffused with energy. He realized now that he hadn't imagined the hum earlier. It had been this sound, coming from this sealed door. In slow motion, like someone in a dream, he reached for the wheel. I would not suggest entering this room. Darien glanced at the hilt. Why not? Do you know what's inside? I have some idea, yes. It may be dangerous for you, although I cannot say for sure. The room ahead is heavily shielded, and my sensors cannot penetrate. Darien waited a moment, then drew himself up stiffly and grabbed the wheel. I need to see what's inside. Very well, but do so with caution. The door swung open silent as a still night. On the other side lay a circular room, and in the center a small pedestal holding nothing. There were no openings in the walls or ceiling, nor any lights. But for some reason Darien couldn't pin down. It did not feel dark. It reminded Darien of the glow let off by the coals of a cooling fire. He stepped inside, keeping his hand anchored on the door. Blue crystal shards crunched musically underfoot. The sense of light came from them, though they emitted no actual light that Darien could see. He took another step inside, let go of the door, and reached down to grab one of the crystals. No, you must not! Before Knight could finish, the door thundered shut. It took Darien's eyes a moment to adjust to the eerie non-light of the broken crystal shards. The door behind wouldn't open, but on the other side of the room Darien spied another doorway. He hurried toward it, not quite panicked. Crystals skittered across the floor, humming harmonically. The further into the room Darien got, the louder the sound became. In the very center, beside the pedestal, the music became an overwhelming presence pushing down on his every side. In the music he heard Kathy's voice, rising and falling along the contours of a story. He heard Mariala's laughter. He heard a woman singing, her song wordless and echoing to a sky he couldn't see. Then, like a gust of wind snuffing out a candle's flame, a mad cackle swept away the music and left Darien with silence. The edges of that cackle continued to echo back and forth. The shadow of a man lurched in the darkness. Darien backed away. In the eerie light of the broken crystal, he could see no defining features of the man. The figure looked as though it had been cut from the space of the room. Inky blackness, deep and deeper than the shadow itself, bled from where an eye should be. Hello? The figure did not reply, only continued to shamble toward Darien. Darien, that is no man. Knight's voice shook. You must leave this room at once. Darien spun and ran. The crystal shards skittered under his feet, but they made no music now. He grabbed the wheel of the opposite door. It groaned as he tried to turn it, but would not release. Behind him, steps grew closer. The shadow would get him, and once it had its black hands around his throat, Darien knew he would never leave this room. With a shriek, the wheel gave. The door opened, and Darien spilled into the day. He slammed the door shut and drew back from it until he hit a wall. He waited for the wheel to turn, waited for the door to open, waited for the shadow to step out after him. But it never happened. He didn't hear so much as the thump of hands on the other side of the door. The daylight seemed strangely dull, as though it was just a memory of the light inside the room. What the palace was that thing? That room would have been the heart of the ship once, Knight spoke in a hushed voice. You mean it would have been, what, the engine room? Like so much else, the engine within is shattered and broken now. The shadow within was an artifact, something cold and black and hungry. I do not know what shape it took for you, but to my sensors it was just a void in space-time. I don't understand. I didn't see a void. I saw a man. Never mind what you saw, Knight's voice snapped. It's gone now. That's all that matters. Let's go. This place holds nothing for us. Nothing. They walked in silence, the sword and the boy, through the corridors of a ship. Yet even in the silence a hum followed them in the bones of the old vessel. It followed them to what had once been a room. Now only a circle of metal pillars remained. Dark blue grass swayed along the floor. In the center of the circle, on a bed of moss and flowers, lay a skeleton. The pitted, dirty bones looked small and fragile beside the great gleaming bones of the ship. It had long since scattered and no longer held the shape of a human. The skull stared up with eyes dark and wide and full of sorrow. Small flowers, purple and red, surrounded the remains. Darien knelt. He reached out, as though to touch the bones, but his fingers curled back. Who had it been? Had they been on the ship when it crashed? Or were they the bones of a scavenger who died here as alone and forgotten as the ship in which he lay? Darien left the ship on the road, dust-coated tears on his face. On top of a distant hill, before the ship passed from view, Knight whispered something so quiet there was no way Darien could miss the words on the wind. Farewell. In 2 weeks, on Palace of Mirrors, Darien and Knight find themselves in the grasp of a pirate captain named Bluebeard.